Hey guys, and welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. So one of the questions that I often get asked is, what is the best monitor you can buy at the moment for gaming, or what monitor delivers the ultimate gaming experience? Of course, there are a lot of choices for monitors out there at the moment, and that makes picking one variant as the best for gaming a pretty tricky task. 4K, 5K and even 8K displays sit at the top of the resolution charts at the moment, but everyday PC gamers would struggle to hit 60 FPS at these resolutions, and we know how important hitting 60 FPS is for PC enthusiasts. Ultra-wide panels are a personal favorite of mine. I love gaming on my 1344 by 1440 Acer Predator X34, but the increased resolution over 1440p, the high price of these monitors and the additional width doesn't necessarily make it the right choice for everyone. However, there is one type of monitor though that ticks nearly every box for high quality PC gaming. One that provides a good mix of resolution and high refresh rate while still being realistically usable on today's most popular gaming hardware. I'm of course talking about the latest 27-inch 1440p IPS monitors that hit a whopping 165Hz with support for adaptive sync. These monitors hit the mark in many respects, and today we're going to explore what sort of gaming experience you can expect with such a feature-laden display. But first, let's quickly talk about display hardware. There are a number of 27-inch 1440p 165Hz monitors on the market. Most of them are pretty expensive, but most use the same AU Optronics AHVA panel, with AHVA being the company's proprietary IPS technology. It's a pretty confusing name. It actually has nothing to do with vertical alignment VA technology, so it's pretty much the same as some of the IPS panels that you've seen before. The panel has a 1000:1 contrast ratio, 4 millisecond response times, 350 nits of peak brightness, and from my experience with one, fantastic viewing angles and color performance that can be calibrated to meet sRGB standards. I happen to have one of these panels in for testing inside the ViewSonic XG2703-GS. Thankfully, you won't have to hear me say that product name too often. It's a bit of a mouthful like most monitors, but yeah, it's one of the cheaper options that use the AHVA panel I was talking about before. When I say cheap though, I do mean $700 US, so it definitely sits towards the top of monitor pricing. But before you jump into the comments in protest saying that's not a cheap monitor, because I agree with you, it's not hugely cheap up against other 1440p options, but it's worth noting that a top-end 34-inch IPS ultra-wide will set you back at least $1,200, while a 4K IPS panel with G-Sync is no less than $880. And for those of you who are interested in the new HDR displays coming in the future, and yes, I hope to take a look at some of those soon, expect them to be even more expensive. And the good thing, I guess, is that most people buying a new monitor probably won't think of upgrading again for many years. So if you're after the ultimate monitor experience, I guess $700, well, it isn't too much to pay if you're going to be using it throughout the next couple of years. So you're probably wondering why I'd recommend a 1440p high refresh monitor over something lower resolution or cheaper. Now, it stems from two aspects: current PC hardware and the longevity of monitors, which is something I touched on a little bit before. When you look at the most popular graphics cards in systems being built today, the NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1060 and the GTX 1070 are right at the top of the charts. The GTX 1060 is a great card for 1080p gaming, but those people interested in going above that resolution are looking at the GTX 1070 as a baseline. Plus, I figure that most people looking to drop $700 on a monitor are probably going to have at least a GTX 1070 in their gaming rig anyway, or at least that's what I'd recommend before going and dropping that much cash. With the GTX 1070 chosen as our baseline GPU platform, let's take a look at how it performs at 1440p. Of course, you can go back and look at our previous coverage of GPUs at 1440p, but here's a summary of what to expect. Note that for the following tests, I did actually use a system with a GeForce GTX 980 Ti in it, along with the Ryzen 7 1700X processor. Steve decided that he needed all of our GTX 1070s for use in another project, so I was stuck with the older GTX 980 Ti for these tests, but you know, the performance between the two GPUs is roughly equivalent anyway, so it's pretty much exactly the same as what you'd expect. So let's start with Battlefield 1 multiplayer set to ultra detail settings, which you can see runs pretty well on the GTX 980 Ti at 1440p, hitting upwards of 75 FPS for the most part during this match. With a high refresh panel, 75 FPS does feel more fluid than 60 FPS, which can lead to a small advantage, I guess, in a fast shooter like Battlefield. And of course, if you reduce some of the quality settings, pushing well into the 100 FPS zone is more than achievable even with Ryzen. Deus Ex Mankind Divided runs pretty well at 1440p with the Ultra preset, particularly when you have an adaptive sync monitor, but it does only hit a 52 FPS average during the built-in benchmark, so there's not much of an advantage to grabbing a high refresh monitor at these frame rates. However, dropping the quality preset to high, which doesn't have much of an effect on image quality, does lead to a much better result, pushing above the 60 FPS mark. Fallout 4 is a game I played a lot of, but it does have some performance issues. Things like random frame rate drops and other stutters and hitches are common throughout the game, but you can get some of those issues fixed simply by setting the shadows to medium, which is what we did for the rest of this test. And this leads to a great result here, comfortably sitting in the 85 to 100 FPS zone. Not the best optimized title or the most visually impressive, but it's a good look at how some older titles currently run on the GTX 980 Ti at 1440p. Prey is a modern title built using CryEngine, so it's no surprise it runs pretty well on this sort of gaming hardware when you aren't playing in a grass-filled, physics-laden sandbox. This is a title that runs spectacularly at 1440p, regularly hitting above 100 FPS in the less intensive parts of the games, and more like 75 FPS in the larger areas, so you'll definitely benefit from having a monitor that pushes above 60 Hz when you're hitting things like 100 FPS. Rise of the Tomb Raider, when set to DirectX 11 mode and without super sample anti-aliasing, leads to a decent 1440p experience in the geothermal valley, with frame rates hovering around the 60 FPS during my capture run. Switching to the high preset delivers around 10 extra frames per second, which adds to the fluidity of the game on high refresh monitors, though naturally you can push the title down even further if you really want to deliver huge frame rates. The Witcher 3 is an older title now, but it's still pretty intensive to run. This is a game that only hits around 40 FPS on ultra settings while using my 3440 by 1440 Predator X34 monitor, but when switching over to this 1440p display, we're seeing around a 60 FPS average. Disabling Hairworks improves performance significantly. I know a lot of you guys out there love to disable all your GameWorks features straight out of the box for only a minor quality decrease, while dropping the detail preset down to high as well pushes the average frame rate into the 80 to 90 FPS zone, another sort of frame rate zone that will benefit from that higher refresh rate monitor. Watch Dogs 2 is the most intensive title here, running at around 40 to 50 FPS using the Ultra preset at 1440p. However, this can be pushed into the 60 FPS range with using the high preset, and even further up into the 70 FPS zone using the medium preset. Not the best showcase of what 165Hz monitor can do at 1440p with this hardware, though not every game is going to dominate with high frame rates at ultra detail settings. In general, what you would have seen throughout our testing is the GTX 1070, or in our case the GTX 980 Ti, is well suited to gaming at 1440p. At ultra detail settings, the GPU sits at around 60 FPS in most modern AAA titles, but if you're willing to sacrifice a few settings, your frame rate can push well into the 80 to 100 FPS zone. More powerful graphics cards like the GTX 1080 or GTX 1080 Ti, and I imagine a lot of people out there building high-end systems using those cards over the 1070, especially if you're thinking of purchasing a $700 monitor, well, those cards hit higher frame rates more often at high details levels and can benefit more from the 165Hz display. At resolutions higher than 1440p, such as 4K or 3440 by 1440 ultra-wide, it's unlikely you'll be consistently hitting 60 FPS at ultra detail settings, particularly at 4K. As a gamer that prefers performance over resolution, this is why 1440p is such an attractive option. You'll still get high quality gaming experience with increased detail over 1080p, but unlike with even higher resolutions, it's actually possible to hit high frame rates on popular graphics cards like the GTX 1070, and that's something we've demonstrated, I guess, throughout this video. With this in mind, it makes sense to get the most out of gaming at 1440p, and that starts with a high refresh monitor. If you use a GTX 1070 or better, a standard 60Hz 1440p display is likely not making the most of your hardware. If a game runs at well above 60 FPS like Prey at ultra quality settings, your experience on a 60Hz monitor won't be nearly as smooth or as fluid as on a monitor that pushes above 60Hz. The difference even going to 100Hz is massive and clearly noticeable while gaming. It's something you really have to try yourself to fully understand, but once you experience it, you'll definitely be craving higher refresh rates over higher resolutions. At 1440p, there are several options for higher than 60Hz monitors. The most common use an older 144Hz TN panel, while newer options use the 165Hz AHV IPS panel that I discussed earlier. The superior quality of the IPS display and 21Hz higher refresh rate introduce around $150 price premium, but if you want the best quality in terms of contrast, viewing angles and colors, there's no doubting that you'll get that with an IPS panel rather than a TN, and the additional refresh rate is a nice bonus to have. It's for this reason that 1440p monitors at 165Hz are the ultimate option for gamers right now, at least in my opinion, and it's what I'd recommend if you ask me what the best gaming monitor is right now. They're an especially good choice if you plan on keeping this type of monitor for several years, because as higher performance graphics cards become more affordable, you'll be able to upgrade your GPU for a reasonable price and come closer to hitting the 165Hz limit on these displays. And in the meantime, you still get the benefit of high refresh rates where your current hardware and in-game graphics preferences allow. Hope this video has given you a good idea of what to expect while gaming on a 1440p 165Hz monitor with reasonably affordable hardware like the GTX 1070, and why I reckon this is the best gaming monitor option right now. If these sorts of monitors are of interest, you can check their prices in the description below, particularly for the ViewSonic XG2703-GS, which we use for all of our testing, and I'll catch you in the next one.